In this short video, I'll be demonstrating just how you can easily create this cel-shaded cursive logo animation using Cinema 4D Lite and Adobe After Effects. So let's start in Illustrator where I created my script logo path. You can see that I have this separated out into 3 individual layers with each element on its own layer. Now, importing Illustrator paths into Cinema 4D Lite is as easy as just saving out a file. The only thing we need to make sure of is that we save it in a version that is compatible with Cinema 4D Lite, and that version is Illustrator 8. So I'll just hit OK and save that out. Next, we'll launch Cinema 4D Lite from inside Adobe After Effects. So we'll just go to File, New, Maxon Cinema 4D File. So After Effects will first prompt you to set a location on your computer to save this new Cinema 4D file. So I'll just hit save this to the desktop, and that will then launch Cinema 4D Lite. So once we're in Cinema 4D Lite, we can just go to File, Merge, and grab our Illustrator file, hit OK, and you'll see we now have our paths inside of Cinema 4D. To generate geometry using our splines, we're going to do a 3D version of what you'd call stroking a path in Illustrator or using 3D stroke in After Effects, and use what's called a sweep object to generate geometry. So here's our sweep object. Now for a sweep object to work, you need to define the profile spline that you want to sweep across a spline. So what I'll do is I'll create a circle spline for our profile shape, and how the sweep object works is you need to first drag underneath it and make it a child of the sweep object, the object that you want as the profile shape. So that is our circle, and then followed by the spline that you want to sweep that circle along. So you can see with our circle being fairly large, if I just scale this down a little bit, bring this radius down, you can see that this circle profile spline is being swept along the length of our accent spline here. So in our sweep object options, we have a caps parameter, which we can then add some fillet caps and actually round out the edges of our caps. To give our sweep thickness more contrast and interest, we can add variable thickness by going to our sweep object spline scale editor in the Details tab. Here you can control-click and add points where you can adjust the scale of that stroke along the spline. Since we're working in 3D space, we can add Z-depth to our spline by selecting points and moving them back and forth in Z-space. This is also a great exercise to getting used to utilizing all of your 3D views to get precisely the look that you want. So now we can easily apply some 2D cel shading to this 3D object using a combination of shaders in Cinema 4D. So what we're going to do is double click in our material manager, create a new material. We'll just call this cel shading. And I'll just double click that new material to open it up. And then I'll go ahead and just apply this to all of our sweep objects here. And what we're going to do is turn on interactive render region so we can get a nice preview of what our final render is going to look like. So right now we have some specular highlights and some diffuse shading due to our color and our reflectance channel with our specular. So I'm just going to turn both of those off, and I'm just going to turn on the luminance channel. And you're going to notice that this now applies a flat white color to our object. So we're already getting a type of 2D shading already. But what we're going to do is use a combination of very useful shaders to try to recreate some cel shading. And the 2 shaders we're going to use are the Lumas shader, which basically loads up a specular channel into our luminance channel. And we're also going to use a colorizer. Now, colorizer is kind of like Colorama in After Effects. So we basically remap those grayscale colors to new values based on a gradient. So what we're going to do is change the color from about 20% gray to white, turn up the luminance to 100%, and then just turn off all of these other specular highlights here. So you'll see that in our preview window, we now have a type of diffuse shading that is 100% white and that goes all the way to 100% black. So you can see, if we jump back into our luminance channel, jump into our colorizer, you can see that that grayscale value of the diffuse shading is now remapped to this yellow, red, and black. So what we can do with our gradient is twirl down the gradient options and change the interpolation between each of these gradient colors from a smooth knot to none. And you're going to see right away that we now have no interpolation between those colors, and as we move these knots and reposition them, you can see I'm actually changing how these colors are being applied to the contour of our 3D object. And again, we're kind of recreating a type of cell shading, which is really, really cool. So what we can now do is just change these colors to some different colors. So I'll just double click on the gradient knots, maybe make a magenta type color, and I'll just delete the last knot, double click and create a new one. This will just be a darker magenta for more of our darker shades. And now I can adjust like this highlight color of this white chip and move it to the right, and you can see we'll get less of those highlights, so we just get a really nice specular highlight. And the great part about this whole setup is now I can actually go and create a light. I'm going to choose an infinite light, and how infinite light works are they are this massive huge light source that doesn't actually light based on the position of the light. It's actually based on the rotation of the light. So if I hit R to bring up my rotation bands, I can actually position this and have my light source coming from the top right. And you can see that's actually changing how my specular highlights and that cell shading effect is being applied to my object. So now I can double click back into my material editor, and maybe I can say, all right, maybe we need more highlights, so I'll just move this chip to the left and we'll get more of those specular highlights. And I can still update and change the rotation of my infinite light here, and you can see that depending on how we position this is going to totally change this look. Plus, we can go into our infinite light, go to shadow, and turn on hard shadows, because we don't want soft shadows. Hard shadows would be the best kind of cartoony cell shading type of shadow. And now you can see that, hey, we now have shadows applied to our object. So by using the combination of the Lumas and colorized shaders, we recreated a cell shading type of rig. So I'm going to select all of my sweep objects here, and you're going to notice we have a start growth and end growth. And as I adjust the end growth on these objects, you can see that we are basically animating these strokes or 3D sweeps onto our screen. So all we have to do is simply set some keyframes for each of these end growths. So I'll go ahead, go to frame 0, bring the end growth all the way down to 0, hit a keyframe, go about 20 frames, and then just change my end growth all the way up to 100%, set another keyframe, and you can see we have effectively written on that piece of our logo. So here's our fully animated logo after animating all of our sweeps and growths. So here we are in After Effects, and I have a composition with just some pre-made splashes that I want to go along with my logo. So all I'm going to do to bring in my Cinema 4D project is drag and drop this Cinema 4D file, place it into my comp, and this will come into my composition as a Cineware layer. In my Cineware effects settings, I'm going to change my renderer from software to standard final so I can get a fully rendered image in my composition with full quality. And now I can just RAM preview. So you can see how easy it is to composite our 3D elements from Cinema 4D with cell shading into our After Effects composition without ever needing to render anything out of Cinema 4D Lite. So if you're an animator looking for that bridge that allows you to add 3D to your 2D workflow and introduce 3D depth into your compositions to help your work stand out, Cinema 4D Lite is the perfect addition to your Adobe After Effects animation pipeline.